Professor Choudhury needs no introduction. He is currently teaching at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, JNU. He has published two books, Theatre Number Event, 3 studies on the relation between sovereignty, power and truth, published by Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, and Ambedkar and Other Immortals, an untouchable research program. Currently, he is also taking a public seminar course titled Ambedkar and Marx, Principle of Labor, Problem of Service and the Question of Organization, which is organized by the University at the margins. Vaibhav Abnave is an independent filmmaker and a doctoral candidate at the School of International Studies, JNU. His debut feature, Monrag or Monologue, based on the oeuvre of Mahesh Elgunchwar, premiered in India Gold section at 15th Mumbai Film Festival. He has taught at the School of International Studies, Central University of Gujarat.
So thank you, Dev, and University at the Margins on this fantastic initiative for the festival. Of course, I congratulate you on that. I saw the first film, but I couldn't see anything after that, which is my loss entirely. But also, just being an occasion when all of us can come together and discuss certain very, very interesting and crucial issues, but do it slowly, do it patiently, instead of the kind of madness that we're surrounded by. We're talking so much and yet we're making very little sense. So in that kind of an atmosphere, to few of us to come together and talk about things which have deep historical logics and deep histories underlying these considerations, but also have immediate urgency. So in that spirit, there's no one better, and this gives me particular pleasure, to talk to Vaibhav here, who I have known for the last, since I have been teaching in this place, Arts and Aesthetics, when actually Arts and Aesthetics took off, so the full-fledged program, in early 2000, when I started teaching here on a kind of contract basis. One of the first students that I met, though he was not part of Arts and Aesthetics, that's also interesting, but as a student of a certain course I was doing at that time, on people remember World Theatre, he was one of the first students that I had the pleasure of meeting and discussing several things. Since then, up to now, this is getting. In the meantime, I myself went to other places and taught and wrote my books and did many things, or didn't do many things. Vaibhav, who has been in the School of International Studies and pursuing a fascinating thesis after his MA on international politics, also taught in other places, but in all of this, the running, continuous work and passion, which in a sense unites us and makes this evening possible of this discussion, is a passion geared towards something which is very difficult to name. It is between theatre and cinema. And this between is, I think, something we can talk about. But very concrete, because like they've introduced Eugen's work, he has actually made not one but 2 films, right, Vaibhav? Yeah, 2 films. I have seen 2 of his works. And yet, it is between a film and the world of theatre, because at least both films, not one, both films, are actually concerned with theatre. So the first one I remember as a particularly almost enigmatic experience, because that film is a documentary. Both are in a sense documentaries. But the documentary was actually about the process of a theatre workshop. Or actors, basically the world of actors, in a workshop, which was filmed in a way which was extraordinary, because the film was made in close-ups and skewed odd angles. But what you saw was actors as they were, we use a word in theatre, process. But there is probably no film better than the one Vaibhav made, the first film that he made, which actually embodies that, shows that process in its most embodied, and at the same time its most surreal forms between the bodies of actors as they are in a workshop. So my memories of that film, they are, because I saw it a long time back, and I just saw it once. But my memories are still very sharp in terms of those surreal images of actors. And that's something which I always remember because it's a particular kind of acting that he brought out in that documentary, which is specific to a kind of regional modernity of Maharashtra, in Marathi theatre. We are not talking about acting in Maharashtra today, but I would love to have a conversation like that with Vaibhav some other day. But it is something relevant because we are talking of, after all, things that are happening in cinema, because many of those actors are really today working in the cinema. And that is the kind of acting that I have seen which is almost unique in the paradigm of modern Maharashtra theatre and cinema. There is a whole history to that, of course. You can take it up to at least Dr. Sriram Lagu. But whatever it is, it develops an idiom which I have not found anywhere else. I remember a production of Uddhav's Dharamshala in which a very well-known Bengali actor in the Bengali translation, by Ashok Mukhopadhyay, he was acting the part which Sriram Lagu used to have. And it didn't work at all. Because you saw that even Ashok Mukhopadhyay is in the realistic idiom, but he's following a kind of convention of realistic acting. While in Maharashtra, though of course maybe I'm romanticizing Maharashtra a little bit, you forgive me for that, but what I found in Vaibhav's film was a kind of, not a realistic as in the convention of realism in acting, but something where acting is touching the real, or acting is almost indistinguishable from an encounter with something which is not realism as convention, but something like the real. And that is particularly in the gesture in the body. So that's the first film. And then the second film that I saw, the one which was premiered in the festival, they've announced it, was the one on Mahesh Choudhury. Again, a film on theatre, Mahesh Choudhury's work, but not, again, a linear, conventional film on Mahesh Choudhury's work, but Mahesh Choudhury in the theatre. Again, in the site. So the word I'd like to highlight, and I'd ask Vaibhav if he thinks it's a word that he agrees with, it's a kind of site. Whether that site is a site for politics, whether that's a site for social reality, or it's a site for theatre itself. So theatre as a site for theatre. So in that sense, theatre has already been inserted into a history of theatre itself. And Mahesh Choudhury as a kind of emblem, as a kind of index of that kind of internal layering of theatre as a site for theatre itself. And in that sense, the actor embodies this layering. The actor is someone who is performing, the actor is also someone who is layered by a certain historicity. So in the film, which you should see, we did do a show of it in Arts and Aesthetics some years back. You should see the film, because in the film, again, it's the actor's presence. Because there's a film, there's a play by Mahesh Choudhury, a kind of swan song play that he wrote, Nattasamrat, right? Actor.
Yeah.
Nattasamrat is
Reminded you.
Yeah, but it's the same kind of So it's an actor's soliloquy, actor's memories of his life and work. So that's why I used the term swan song, which is played by Chekhov, the same idea. But what Vaibhav does in his film is actually show Mahesh Choudhury's work through the figure of the actor. So it's impossible to say whether it's Mahesh Choudhury the actor or an actor playing Mahesh Choudhury's lines in the theatre. But again, that complex layering of something contemporary and historical, but in the same body and in the same site. But then, and that's the point I'm coming to, all of this in the cinema, because what is it that I'm seeing? It's an image. It is an image. I'm not seeing it in 3 dimensions. I'm seeing it on a screen as an image. So then the question of the meaning and the status of the image is something Vaibhav is, as a filmmaker, exploring with that sort of seriousness and also inventiveness. But that he's doing it through the theatre and between theatre and cinema as merely 2 names for 2 art forms. But that betweenness is itself the site in which both theatre and cinema are fusing in the image or in the body. This is something which has fascinated me in Vaibhav's own work. So that's one part. The other part there are three parts to this introduction of my talking with over a long time. So this is the first part. The second part is my talking to him through the classroom in relation to theatre, but a little bit of what has never really happened, but something which have brought two of us together as both trying to work, not in the cinema in this case, but in the theatre together. Which never happened, but both of us at some point were planning to do something together. Again, something which is from a text which is very important, which in my first course that I did in Arts and Aesthetics on World Theatre, formed the first theme of the course, the playwright Georg Buchner. So the play that we used to study in that course was, of course, a play that you people study about Arts and Aesthetics students, which is the play Whitesec. And Whitesec, when we saw it, when we read it in class, once we read it, we saw it as a film. Werner Herzog's film. And what happened there was also very interesting. The first thing that happened was that we saw it as an image. While in the play, when we were reading it as dialogue. We were reading it as the lines of the first scene of Whitesec, as the lines that this character Whitesec, who is a worker in the sense that he's a military worker, he's a worker in the sense of the lowest officer or lowest ranked person in the military hierarchy, literally a subaltern. So here is a subaltern military worker who is the main character. So in the play we hear the lines, what he says. But in the film, Herzog's film, the first image that we see is something very striking, which is actually a gesture of mime of the officer hitting Klaus Kinski, who plays the role of Whitesec, hitting him with his boot, kicking him and hitting him on the head. And this man is lying down he is on the ground, and he's getting hit. And this hitting is not for a reason. The hitting is simply a kind of official military punishment. It's an act of sheer gratuitous discipline. So the first image of that film is this sort of gesture of obedience, violent gesture of obedience, making someone obedient. So again, the question of image as a condition of cinema, but also as cinema's image as a condition of the world. Because this is also considered to be the first modern play when you have a working class hero. A hero who is not heroic. A hero who actually is seen, can you imagine a hero being hit on the head continuously, again and again and again? It's totally passive, totally a creature of obedience. Someone who has to obey. So that's again an image that we saw together in those first years of Arts and Aesthetics when I started teaching here. And since then, at some point, both of us thought that we could actually take something from Buchner, which is one novel that Buchner wrote, which is a kind of documentary novel, because it's written in the mode of a diary. And it's a diary by someone called Lenz. And Lenz himself, before Buchner, was a playwright in Germany. And he was a playwright who had a kind of history of madness, a psychosis, schizophrenia. So the diary that Buchner wrote for Lenz was a diary of these schizophrenic entries. But it's a fascinating diary of a so-called mad person's perception of the world. It's again a kind of soliloquy. So I and Vaibhav were considering doing this soliloquy as a performance. We never did it, but it's something which both of us were considering. So that's the second part where there is a kind of betweenness and this kind of interest of doing something through the theatre, and who knows, it is something cinematic between the two of us. And the third part, which is something which brings us to today's discussion and the festival that has been happening for the last 3 days, which is to look at cinema and look at art in the sight of something like not politics merely, but something like the concept of politics. At what point, on what ground can politics be thought, and correlatively, on what grounds can art be taught? Now, of course, there are films, just like there are plays. There is clearly politics, in the sense that, there are things that happen which are political. So much is going on in the world, in our country, all kinds of things. As we talk, we know what's happening. So to that extent, political is something we cannot not be living in a political world. But we cannot not be living in a world of images either, no? In today's times, and in what we call modernity, maybe in the last 100, 120 years, we are living in the world of images, reproduced images. So at that level, it is something real, no doubt. But the real question becomes when something is so banal and so obvious that we live in images and we live in politics. Then the real challenge is to ask ourselves, is it possible to think something specifically when something is so general and so, so much common to our existence? Is there any specificity left? If there are images and images and images, then can we ever think of what is an image? If there is politics and politics and politics, can we ever think of what is politics? So, is it possible then to make politics rare? Is it possible to make cinema rare when there is so much cinema and the world is impossible without cinema? When there is so much politics and the world is impossible without thinking about the world as political? But is it possible then, in all of this, to think of politics, to think of cinema? So it seems to me that one of the fascinating questions that was raised in this initiative by University of the Margins, and this is my first point that I would raise with Vaibhav, and I would like to know if he thinks this is worth pursuing, is whether to think of revolution as a point of this reality. Revolution is something which can be this figure or this theme, this motif of something which is rare, both in art and in politics. And yet in itself, precisely because of this rarity, it demands to be thought. And in a way, only if it is thought can it be made real. While in the other case, when it's a case of cinema, then whether you think it or not, it is real. In politics, whether you think it or not, it is real. I mean, you don't wait for political philosophy to tell you what politics is. You know it is, we live in a political world. You don't wait for any kind of discourse on cinema to tell you what cinema is. We live in a world of images. Yeah? But when we use something like revolution, the word revolution, then is that an occasion? Is that an opportunity to make these presuppositions, these lived worlds, thinkable of cinema and politics? So, in other words, not to make revolution on the side of politics or on the side of cinema, but as this word that I use between me and Vaibhav, which is between cinema, revolution is between this, of cinema and politics. And this discussion that we are doing today, in a sense, is something that we're doing with this question in a way upon us, urgently upon us. But as I said to begin with, urgently but patiently. I think that is demanded of us. So in that spirit, the triangulation, as Shomik in his initial presentation very, very, very precisely brought out, the triangulation between cinema, revolution, and insofar as we are speaking of thinking, philosophy. This triangulation, but in a concrete way, not in a scholastic way, not as part of any kind of academic agenda. Is it something which we can make as today's topic in which we can spend some time? Would that suit Vaibhav? That's my first question.
It's a fascinating question, and I think I would sort of take off from the thinkability of revolution as in-betweenness and cinema and revolution. So, how do we think revolution with cinema or them together? What kind of a relationship is possible? And in his opening remarks, Shomik has laid out a fascinating framework where he says that they can be thought together primarily as a triangle where philosophy is the third player or the site involved. And what kind of a relationship exists between these three? And there I think I would like to start with how a certain philosophy which emerged in last 40 years or so, or 50 years, particularly in France, which goes by the name of Vaibhav Abnave, gives us some clues. And I think those clues are particularly trying to make philosophy a warehouse, not a master. So philosophy is not, as you said, going to lay down the script or the blueprint of the world to unfold. Philosophy will take a step back. We'll look at the world urgently but patiently. We'll look at the things which happen out there in the world and which Badiou names as events, as ruptures. So in that sense, revolution with Badiou is extracted out of its classical revolutionist paradigm, where revolution were seen historiographically in a modern sense as progressive stages, where humanity as such, as Kant would say, progresses forward. So with French Revolution, the entire humanity progresses. So revolutions are those stages in human evolution, in a certain sense. Whereas with Badiou, we have a very different image or a different thinkability of this problem of revolution, where it says revolution cannot be seen in this evolutionary paradigm of stages. They are ruptures, and I mean, this is something we've written a great book on that, and on French historiography of French Revolution, theatre, number, and event, and I've learned a great deal from that. I apologize for speaking on that, but yeah, I mean, still I will continue. So, I think with the idea of event, what we have is not revolution as something which can be represented. Because revolution is a placelessness. It's like a void point. It does not have the spatio-temporal coordinates which we assumed it had. When did it happen? Where did it happen? But yes, we have names. We have names which are attached to the event, like French Revolution. And then the problem is, okay, what is the relation between the event and the name? Where did the names come from? Or is it a name that belonged to itself? Who names it? Who ages? So that, I think, is the first point I would like to make. The second is, I think with Badiou, he's also touching the question of cinema from a very different angle. He's saying that though cinema as a medium emerged only recently, cinema as a desire existed all along, which can be traced back to even ancient Greek philosophy, which is a desire for projection. And if you look at the Platonic allegory, you would have something which is akin to cinema there, which is the truth of shadows, of appearances, of projections, and as you said, of screens, where you do not really have an access to the things in themselves. But that does not make the shadows any less real or any less, ontological sense. They are not inferior. They are not secondary. They are not mere copies, but yet they are copies. And the way in which he formulates the problem of cinema, especially in our times, where, as you said, we are saturated by images all around us all the time, is that cinema is the site of struggle between good and bad images. And what do we mean by good and bad images? If I were to paraphrase what Badiou suggests there, is that I think the bad images are primarily presenting themselves as evidences of the world, which are claiming a certain representational sort of status that this is world is. Whereas a good image is that which will make you see, which will not show you but make you see. So the image is in seeing, in imagining. So image is an encounter. Image is not a thing, which is not static. So every time a film is played out, the image is emerging for the first time. So in that sense, image is an encounter with the unknown, with the singular difference. So that is the second point. And I think it's quite fascinating to think revolution as betweenness. First is, he says, cinema is a melancholic art. It's the art of the vanishing. And here he's juxtaposing that with theatre, which is his preoccupation as a theatre maker, as a playwright. And he says, in theatre, there is an embodiment of idea. The idea actualizes itself in here and now, then and there, and it creates a great deal of seriousness, a sense of urgency that you have to take sides. You cannot just sit and remain passive and neutral. The stakes of the situation are raised to a greater heights than the mere normal everyday situation. Whereas in cinema, to use his word, idea passes. There's a visitation, like a ghost which passes. But it is a vanishing image, the image which cinema creates. And which is obviously, like we have this thing in Hindi cinema that the police always comes after the event. In that sense, cinema is always there after the event. It's, or in the Hegelian sense, it's the hour of Minerva taking a flight at the twilight. So it is that which always comes to accumulate things. Or like an archaeologist who's basically trying to make sense of the world with whatever pieces left, speculating, imagining, and so on and so forth. So this melancholic nature of cinema, I think, is something very useful for us to now think the relation between cinema and revolution. Because if revolution needs to be thought outside of the paradigm, the heroic paradigm of classical revolution as some sort of a destination or actualization in the totalizing sense, where somebody embodies revolution, says that I am the revolution, or a party as a revolution, or capturing state power as a revolution. If you want to think revolution outside of that, then I think this cinema provides us an insight that it is the vanishing image which will help us think event, which leaves only minimal traces. And those traces are still, when we say minimal, it does not mean that it is inferior. It is extremely intense. And how do we touch the intensity of those minimal traces? Through cinema, where, and that is where the third point he makes is very important, and I think it is an extremely counterintuitive point, that cinema is the least mimetic of all arts. Because the general understanding we have is that cinema begins with verisimilitude and this photographic realism and the claim to reality in its fullest sense, where you can capture almost everything now the world we are living in. There is an obsession with virtual reality goggles and Atmos and 3D, 5D, 7D and all that. So the experience, accumulation of sensual property of experience is what defines a certain paradigm of cinema around us, or image consumption in general, not cinema in a classical sense. So in such times, I think it would be a useful thing to remind that it is least mimetic of all arts, primarily because, and that is where I think the first point is very important, that it is a melancholic art, that the vanishing traces which are left on or imprinted upon the cinematic images are like constellations. Like Rancière says in Future of Image, that image is basically not a replica but a set of relationships. So certain dots are to be joined by the spectators when they watch those images. And then joining the dots make the image what it is. It is not the creator. But obviously, so it's not like the duality that either the beauty or the image lies in the work of an art or in the eyes of the beholder. It's neither, it's the encounter. And I think somewhere the cinema as an encounter can help us think the relationship between cinema and revolution as an event more productively.
Fantastic. Because now it's becoming more and more fascinating as an improvised discussion, while there is hopefully some rigor to what we're saying here. But we'll very quickly take it to the rest of everyone here.
Yeah.
But just a couple of improvised responses. So there are two ways of really responding to these points, these wonderful points that you make through Ali Badiou's writing in cinema. So one skeptical response could be that, which is not just on the question of cinema, but on the understanding of revolution. If a philosopher like Ali Badiou speaks of revolution outside or against the classical way of looking at revolution, then the skeptical response could be that he sees someone who is being led actually not by revolution at all, but by counter-revolution. That because we are in an age where revolutions have failed and the revolutionary paradigm has actually collapsed, and we are in an age of capitalism and counter-revolution, hence, even the thought of revolution has to be virtualized. Or even the thought of revolution has to be necessarily then falls into something which is a constellation or something like a vanishing idea, rather than something present in the sense of act, something like an act. So, Ali Badiou's own preoccupation with looking at philosophy and anti-philosophy actually would, also mean that this vanishing idea of revolution or revolution as a trace or even as an idea would be on the side of philosophy, while revolution in the classical sense would be on the side of anti-philosophy as an act. But since that act has failed, or the very possibility of that act does not exist anymore as a thinkable idea, hence we are talking of revolution, but actually led by counter-revolution. I'm saying this could be a very important, I think, skeptical response to as a kind of Ali Badiou as a communist, but still a revisionist. So that's one point. Yeah. The second response to this entire discussion would, of course, concern itself with cinema. And there the question is that, after all, in the history of cinema, there is something like an end of cinema thesis also. That in a way, with technological shifts, which are tectonic shifts, and with the change also of this entire global economic system, we have already gone beyond the end of cinema. So in a sense, we are in the age of images, but which is post-cinematic. So not in the cinema in the sense of something which corresponds to late capitalism. Yeah, from 19th century to late capitalism. But in post-late capitalism, that is the neoliberal kind of cinema, what we are getting is just like neoliberalism is supposed to, create something like a micro-logic of capitalist existence. Global, but at the same time micro-logical. In that sense, cinema is now granulated to video, all the digital work that people do, and everything that's granulated. That's actually image rather than cinema. I mean, this could be a very empirical point through technology, but something which is important as a paradigm shift. But what does it mean to speak of end of cinema? Just like in end of theatre, we actually speak of the two greatest theatre thinkers of our time, Brecht and Arthur, in early 20th century, and in a particular political conjuncture, which is exactly the conjuncture where Walter Benjamin is writing that cinema is not coming. So cinema is coming with something like end of Western theatre as the model of serious, like you said, theatre as a place where something serious is going on, something which is present to the world, present to people. Theatre as the paradigm of something like a political assembly, direct democratic assembly. Theatre being the paradigm. Politics follows theatre till then. But with mass reproduction technologies, with cinema, we actually, Benjamin writes, we are at a point when you have to actually, politics is to choose what to do with this. And will that politics be fascist? Will it be proletarian? Something we were discussing yesterday. So actually cinema poses to the world the question of revolution and fascism at that point. And in a way revolution wins. It's a hard fight, it's a terrible fight, it's a bloody fight, but revolution wins. Yeah? So Benjamin died, he paid with his life for that fight, we know that. But Benjamin would, in that sense, be, vindicated because it was a kind of victory. But actual since then up to now, what we also see is a slow defeat of that wealth, the defeat of the victorious, yeah, which is technological, neoliberal capitalism's biopolitical techniques, where the paradigm of cinema, the paradigm of this kind of late capitalist idea of cinema as industry, cinema as the paradigm of something like global appropriation of a new value that you could talk about as spectacle value, image value. Yeah. So a new mode of creating value. That, in a way, also from within, it displays cinema, because if value can be created post-cinematically, then what's the point of having cinema? So in that sense, move cinema out of the cinema halls and move it to the computer, move it to niche ideas, and so on and so forth, where technology and politics come together as a kind of revenge on the great victory of cinema and revolution in the early 20th century. Yeah? So that would be one narrative. But this is not the interesting thing. This is more or less obvious to all of us. The interesting thing is, like in the case of theatre, it is exactly in the duration of the end that the greatest theatrical thinking happens, like with Arthur and Brecht. Similarly, it is in the duration of the end of cinema that the greatest cinema is created. And Deleuze's book actually is a testament to that, which is, say, the French New Wave, yeah, which is the cahier movement in the thinking of cinema, because that's where cinema is taught. Yeah, it's taught by cinema makers, not in the classroom, and at the same time, all classrooms are made possible because of that movement. And yet, more or less, that's a conjuncture also of the end of cinema, more or less. Yeah, in the next 15, 20 years, all of this happens. So that is always interesting. It is exactly in the duration of something ending that that thing which ends reaches its end. Yeah. Both as an art, but also as an art which is intro-reflective. Now, in that sense, what is the move of cinema as itself, not just philosophy about cinema, but cinema as a kind of cinema thinking? Like Badiou himself says, theatre is a kind of body thinking. Similarly, a kind of cinema thinking. And Deleuze's book probably is the greatest monument to that cinema thinking in two ways. But exactly finishing at 1980s. So you literally have cinema from Europe to the third world. So you get an idea of cinema now as something like political cinema, which is part of a new, what Deleuze calls a new third world performative, new third world speech act. When cinema is making the speech act possible that the people of the third world are missing, the people are missing. But it's actually a cinema of the people, where the people are missing. Which is very different from the European cinema, where it's an auteur cinema. It's a cinema which is still led by heart. Yeah. But it is precisely this movement between cinema as art and cinema as political that this end of cinema is being played out. Because after all, capitalism is interested not in third world cinema separately or European cinema separately. It's interested in the industry, which is potentially always everywhere, globally. So in this kind of a complex interplay of end of cinema and this brilliant cinema thinking, which is reflected in actual philosophical works on cinema like Deleuze's books, and at the same time, the moment this end actually is actualized, you are done with revolution. That is the thing. So this melancholy that Badiou speaks of, my question is this melancholy an intrinsic question of cinema, or is it something which is a symptom of this post-cinematic experience, of which surely Badiou is also part?
I think here we need to make difference between melancholic as a subjective response to the time one lives in, and melancholy as an ontological condition of cinema. And I think there is a difference there. And for that, I think three moments would be interesting to see. We talked about French New Wave, but after that, I think from mid-60s onwards, you have a new constellation of cinemas going by various names emerging, and I don't think they can simply be classified as cinema now going into third world. Because even at the heart of Europe, you have something like Ziegler Collective, and the break in Godard's career after Lashino. So a film like any other, that's where the beginning of that. And Tu Abia is the beginning of an end of that sequence. So Zigaberto is one such moment where the attempt is, and as Ronsier discusses in Film Fables, that it's not to make a film about Marxism as representation, but Marxism as principle. So not to make films about politics, but to make films politically. And I think that gesture is contemporaneous to the way Robert Rocha is making, and that conjunctural contemporaneity is quite important. That the 68 is a global moment. It's a moment like Benjamin's interwar moment. It brings various practitioners across the world, say Oshima, Imamura on one hand, Rocha is there, and then of course Mrinal Sen and Rai's Calcutta trilogy is happening here, and I mean, in a certain sense, it's interesting that Shomik started with Czech New Wave, because Czech New Wave actually prefigures a lot of these ideas, and ironically, it ends with 68, with Prague Springs and the Soviet tanks entering. So it really has a very strange, and the end of Czech New Wave is the beginning of the German New Wave, where Kluger makes Yesterday Girl and in 66 and later Artist on the Big Top. So I think that moment needs to be seen differently than the immediate post-war moment. And I mean, I personally am a little hesitant to look at, to agree with Deleuze's periodization of pre-war and post-war cinema. And the separation he makes between the movement and the time, movement image and time image. For two reasons, I'll come to them. But at the same time, I want to also talk about one more sequence which is extremely important, that is what is happening in Poland. And we saw Weiler's film. And in Poland, particularly for 10 years, Weiler is trying to make Man of Marble, is not being able to make it. And suddenly, with the political situation becoming extremely urgent in Poland, he puts the film together, and with the solidarity movement taking on to the streets and capturing the port, he inserts the fiction into actuality in Man of Iron, in the second film. A gesture which is already done by Haskell Wetzler in Medium Cool, where he enters the fiction into the Chicago Democratic Party convention. So I think something new is happening, and there is a great deal of give and take. So I wouldn't necessarily see it as an end in that sense. So in fact, and Batu's own narrative of his engagement with 68 tells us that of course it is an end of a classic revolutionary paradigm. So it is negating the party state model, and it is showing red flag, as Mao says. Of course, what is to come is not known. What is to come does not have a name, does not have any destination. But there are certain principles which are afoot. And these principles can be accumulated strangely on the walls in Paris in 68, like be realistic and demand the impossible, or happiness is a new idea, or workers of the world have fun. Now, these are, I think, some of the new arrows which are being sent. So cinema, I think, in 68 is emerges as an arrow. So it is actually trying to create a certain subjective disposition of approaching the unknown with a certain degree of confidence.
Right.
A desire for, it is trying to activate a desire for unknown.
Right.
And I think it's important because the question of revolution is reopened, and Weiler's film for me is very important, Danton, because he makes Danton with a great deal of urgency in exile. He is forced to leave Poland at the end of 1981 when the film is released, and the entire situation is overtaken. So this revolution, counter-revolution thing is actually, I mean, it's a matter of months things are going this way or that way. Like May 68 ends with the May ending, and the name emerges in a melancholic fashion. But that melancholia is something need not be seen as mourning in a very negative sense. It is constantly be on the move, trying to find the next opportunity to intervene, to re-strategize. and to find new disciplines, new ways of forming collectives, even if they are short-lived, even if they are small. So what happens in Danton, and I think is in this viewing particularly, I could actually see it before that, and I do not know the others would agree with it, but I think he reopens two very important questions. One is, what is revolution? Which means, what is the relation between the name and the event? Because people are acting in the name of revolution. But then, is revolution a body which emerges, a collective which is legislating, and that's where the question of law becomes very important, because law, as Shomik said in his opening remarks, is primarily a function of naming. That who basically decides upon the state of exception, and who calls the shot. So the naming problem, what is the relationship between the name and the principles? Are the principles names, or are they anonymous and generic and available to everyone? And that's where the second question is, what is people? Are people countable? Are they only French? Are they only men? Are they only those who are productive laborers? And those kinds of questions, I think he poses this question of what is people not within the narrative, because deceptively the narrative seems to be about the great heroic figures or tragic figures from Spear and Danton, but it is the people on the soundtrack. And the soundtrack is where he is turning towards one of the greatest inventions of early 20th century music, which is a tonality, a dodecacophonic music, which resists resolution in a harmonic sense. So there is no harmony possible. Where he moves, constantly moves at the edge of noise and sound. Where the didactic sounds of people shouting turns into a music without a resolution. So I think that cinema is reopening these questions and sending new arrows. Where those arrows are going is for us to pick. I mean, whether as subjects of cinema, and here I think the spectators are becoming subject. And you were saying in the discussion yesterday, they used this famous formulation, that cinema is the first art in history where its subject is the mass. Masses are the subject. And somewhere I think, and I would borrow this from your formulation in Gandhinagar, where a lot of these discussions began on Ambedkar and other immortals, that we are moving from a paradigm which was a classical Marxist paradigm of permanent revolution, Trotskyite paradigm in a certain way, where how do we, in a way, continue revolution is basically making it permanent. But obviously we know that doesn't work. That doesn't work at a strategic level, as well as that doesn't work at a subjective level. How do you endure that? What kind of a ethical, subjective response do we develop to endure this? And that's where I think you suggested a third paradigm. If the first paradigm, the Aristotelian paradigm of permanent sovereignty, which is constantly sort of make a distinction between inside and outside, and law and anarchy, and legislate upon inside, and so on, the sovereignty model. If permanent sovereignty and permanent revolution were the two models, I think the third model which is emerging post-68 is, as you suggested, could be seen as permanent conversion. And so cinema, I think, is the site of that permanent conversion, one of the important aesthetic modes of permanent conversion. Because in a way, it is subjecting the audiences to a permanent conversion in a sense of rearrangement of desires.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, and I think in around and 68 is the most important name for that, because 68 is actually polarizing the tension between law and desire. And we know that it's a false kind of an opposition if we look at it in a revolutionary sense, that you cannot counterpose law against desire, because if you go in the direction of law, it is all repression. If you go into the direction of desire, it's completely haywire, it's anarchic. And obviously they are tightly coupled with a certain terror-like situation. So how do we overcome this false opposition is one of the questions cinema is asking. And I think the greatest I would say, manifestation of that is Antonio's Zabriskie point. And Zizek completely misreads that scene in the desert, which he reads as orgy, is actually not an orgy. It is where the two multiplies like a stardust. So the lovers coming together and the intensity of that love explodes. And we come to the explosion toward the end of the film. and for the unknown.
Yeah.
So I think somewhere after 68, we need to see cinema as taking a very different turn, which is of creating new desires. And like to further develop this point is, and somewhere I think I don't think the use touches upon this problem very seriously. Is this Godard's famous formulation that cinema begins with Griffith and ends with Kiarostami? I would say actually cinema recommences with Kiarostami. I mean, it is, and I don't want to make the statement in any non-Western or Asian manner at all. Absolutely not. Kiarostami is the most Europeanist of the filmmaker, if you want to look at it. Or Ozu is the most Europeanist of the filmmaker. That's not the point. It's not a culturalist point. Point is that Kiarostami understands a certain false opposition between the montage and the long take. For the first time, he addresses this problem very seriously. Because there is a polarization between these two traditions. One, the Eisenstein to Godard tradition, that cinema only emerges with interruption, with cutting. And if you look at this problem, it's basically, and it's a strange problem that 24 frames per second we know is the way we perceive things. Now, if we keep on reducing the number of frames, at how many frames do we really stop seeing things? Is a problem Godard has, and he plays with that even in his latest film, Image Book. So 3 frame, 4 frame, 3.5 frame, that's when something appears or disappears. And he's constantly trying to interrupt, and it's a very sincere project, I would say. I'm not dismissing the project. It's a very serious project that if cinema is seducing, we need to interrupt that seduction and create a certain historical consciousness of awareness through interruption. But I think that overemphasizes editorial interventions for that interruptions to happen. On the other hand, the greatest master of long take, Tarkovsky, who both theorizes and practices long take, who says that shot is indivisible. It's like a living organism. If you cut it in the half, it's dead. So somewhere, I think what Kiarostami does, he takes the indivisibility argument of Tarkovsky very seriously. But he says, well, why can't I insert cut within a take? Which is, can I introduce an interruption without cutting? And I think that is his practice all throughout, I would say, particularly if we look at the early works like Life Goes On, and I think that's the moment where he inserts fiction into actuality. Then he takes up car as that space which is still moving and which completely interrupts the distinction between inside and outside, or the movement and the stillness. Later on with Certified Copy, he completely interrupts the distinction between, say, the strangers and the lovers. Are they strangers or are they lovers? If, what is their past? What kind of characters they are, and so on and so forth. And there are several examples in between also where he's practicing that. Or take Fire to Ozu, the film which is a tribute to Ozu, where he's saying, see, at the end of the day, let's not get seduced by the narrative flourish Ozu brings in. Ozu's keen insight is that a static shot is the most dynamic and the moving shot. Because it is touching upon the impermanence, the realm of the impermanence. Things coming and going. And in his last film, 24 frames, he almost actually challenges Godard head on. Godard's famous formulation that photography is truth and cinema is truth 24 times per second, saying no, that truth is indivisible, that cannot be spliced up into frames. Because even a single frame, I mean, he said that with in a conversation with Jean-Luc Nancy before, is that a photograph already has a story. Why? Because we create that story, we need that story. Because photograph is framing and it excludes something. And what it excludes is where the story comes in. So he's the master of the out of frame space, the negative space. And he's done it several times, but the most important one is Shirin, where we see women sitting in auditorium watching a film, but that film can only be heard on the soundtrack. So what is, in fact, that inversion is doing that through the auditory input we are seeing, and through a visual input, we start listening to the stories of those women. So suddenly, I think with Kirosami, he touches the problem of seeing. Seeing is not a visual, so it's not cinema is not an optical situation, as the earlier formulation was. It is actually, to put it like Badiou says, is that in cinema there is no distinction between sensible and intelligible. They are constantly in a tussle, but a tussle which is a disjunctive synthesis, so to say. So it's not that there is a sensuality to an image which seduces us, or we need an image which is didactic or which is insightful. It can be coupled within the same image. It is the sight of to put it more simply, that to sense or to make sense. To sense something, or to feel, affect, and to make sense of something in cinema can be done together. And I think that's where we come, where it doesn't matter whether it's post-cinema, cinema ends or not. It is this minoritarian gesture that image can convert the person's desire. Image can make one see, is the true wager of cinema.
Right. So the last set of remarks that I make in response to these absolutely fantastic and very beautiful points that you made about cinema, and then we open it up. So the skeptic would simply will concede everything that you say, apart from this last point that you made, that yes, indeed, on the one hand, it is this minoritarian or this minor gesture in cinema, that is the whole. And that in a way also has a permanent, since you quote me,
yeah,
I will quote myself. This conversional potential it has, or this kind of a miracle actually, this event of miracle, it happens. That is true. But you see, the skeptic would still say that while all of this is happening, how will you escape? How will you exit the very logic of the greater minoritism, or the greater minor, if you may put it like that, power of capitalism, capital. Because cinema, Fellini once said, in fact, a long time I spoke to Nasiruddin Shah, he quoted Fellini to me. He quoted Fellini to me that Fellini once said that the enemy of cinema is money, and without money, cinema cannot exist. So in that sense, the logic of money, in the sense of circulation, in the sense of granulation, in the sense of fetishization, is exactly the logic of cinema, and at the same time, it is the enemy of cinema, precisely in the sense that you spoke of. Cinema has this rigorous gesture, but a completely evented gesture, so which it cannot fetishize. So in that sense, the tussle within cinema, which is such a beautiful point, is between them. In cinema, there's a tussle between its very condition and itself. Yeah, capitalism is a condition for cinema, that is money, and at the same time, its own resistance to its own condition. Something like that. So, in other words, politically speaking, the question of and this is, now I'm not speaking in the skeptic's voice, I'm speaking for myself. See, one of the slight worries, not worry, but something which I would think about, is a paradigm which is a kind of ascetic paradigm in today's world. Precisely because revolution is not possible, you have, and I fear Rancière is moving in that direction a little bit, which is revolutionaries without the revolution. So it becomes a question of a kind of subjective ascesis. So in this world we can have revolutionaries, but without revolution. I am not very keen to follow that. At the same time, I completely agree with you that revolution cannot be made into a question of positivism. So the arrogance of a certain Marxism, a certain history, which makes revolution a positivist idea, that yes, there is a revolution, Russian, French, XYZ, that is to be absolutely also resisted. And that positivization, but without making it a question of something which becomes a kind of ascesis, subjectivization in that sense that you yourself pointed out, in a very, very, very correct response to me, very important response to me, that Melancholy can be also thought merely subjective. But then revolution should not also be thought merely subjective.
No.
So that's why, in my own work, I speak of a revolution in the Indian, and that is really in the Ambedkarite context, as part of the Dalit movement, where it is neither revolution as a positivist, sort of capture, of saying revolution 1917, revolution 1947, revolution 1927. No, you don't positivize it. But at the same time, to that extent, I'm absolutely with others that dates are important, or dates are unmissable. So 1927 Mahar, not that this is a revolution, but a revolution hypothesis comes into being. Which, in a sense, like a permanent virtuality carries us. So neither do we become revolutionaries in the aesthetics. I'm not saying you are saying it, I'm just pointing out all these possibilities of thinking. Neither do we become revolutionaries in the aesthetic sense, nor is it a revolution in the positivistic, arrogant sense of a certain left tradition, but something which is a permanent reserve. Derrida was beautifully said, permanent reserve. So permanent conversion is also permanent reserve of converting. So that reserve of the revolution, something which is kept in reserve, something which no bank can ever, put out as capital. Something which is a saving which cannot be capitalized. That I think in the cinema and in general in art is indeed something to hold on to and to look towards for hope and courage. So that I completely agree with. And there are so many examples, and you already took those examples. I was wanting to ask you this question of the dialectic in editing or in Eisenstein's work and moving to something like Kiarostami, but you already talked about it. So actually your answer is also important because what we are seeing is what we can call this end of cinema, post-cinematic threshold is also in a sense a moment of the very artistic re-evaluation of the very thought of cinema.
Yes.
Moving from the paradigm of something like dialectic, which is editing, to something like, and neither the parallel which was so fascinating in our times when we were watching Godard, we were also watching in two worlds. We are living in the sensible world and in the intellectual world. So Godard was the great materialist, the Brechtian Marxist materialist, and Tarkovsky was the great Platonist poet, but also a kind of Sufi. So we were living in both these worlds together, and Jane is a part of that double life. Absolutely. So we were doing, but with Kiarostami, indeed something new happens, and that's a fascinating point, and it's a technical point at the same time. So that's something which is within this very threshold, which is a threshold of a certain neoliberal threshold, or a certain capture of cinema as industry, but something which again escapes cinema, but which is again to others would say that philosophy, only philosophy. So not a book about cinema as in cinema, cinema text, but philosophy, only philosophy. So in that sense, cinema, only cinema. But cinema which escapes its very condition, which is money, capital. So that Kiarostami moment, I think, is a wonderful moment to talk about. So these are, yes, some responses that I thought. So can we open it up to further questions, or would you like to say something?
A couple of things. Particularly the skeptical question you raised, particularly revolutionaries without revolution. Taking off from that, and how do you respond to the capital, which is the very condition, but the very impossibility. I think one can look at this problem from both ends, which are not polar opposite, but which form continuum. The first end of it is something which is with us right from the beginning, and particularly named very succinctly by Verto, which is man and movie camera. So cinema is primarily the triangulation, that if cinema is one end, it is man and movie camera, which makes it possible. So you would require that separation. And in that direction, something very interesting has happened with Lucretia Martel, an Argentinian filmmaker. She has a very interesting take on what is camera. Now, for the longest time, the whole debate was between subjective and objective point of views. But she says, no, camera is neither subjective nor objective. Camera is pretty much like a 6 to 8 year small little kid sitting and just curiously looking at things, is figuring out things, but is not aware. But it's not the point of view of that little boy. That is what she is hinting at. She is hinting that camera can help us familiarize the world we live in, make us look at it afresh, compel us to confront the ambiguities of the existence, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, camera is, and it's a certain development I feel on Vertov's idea, but Vertov took it little literally. And another important intervention in that is a German filmmaker called Emmy Golds. So Emmy Golds said that what Vertov's mistake was that he thought camera is an eye, kino eye. But he said, no, we also have eyes and camera is there. Camera is not a substitute for our eyes. That was that futurist kind of a temptation. So, okay, this is a new way of seeing. It's not like that. There's going to be a man and movie camera, and the dialectic is always going to be there. So, to see through camera is basically that process, which is one end of the spectrum, with the man and the movie camera. And I think that's where there is a surest guarantee against this fascination with virtual reality goggles, that they cannot really take the place of this dialectic of man and movie camera. So you cannot fully immerse yourself into the world without having that separation. That separation is what camera brings in. And that is what is the condition of any thinking, that a separation from the world, from the thing is, and I think the camera will ensure that. So that is one end. The other end, I would say, and there I think I will be more specific about the Indian condition, is that we have the emergence of something called as Dalit popular, which is reinserting itself into the world of markets and capital and circulation and so on and so forth. So especially in Maharashtra, you have Nagaraj Manjue, Paramjit, and I think that is a very important intervention, that you take up the space of popular and you reinsert the question of desire. Where are your desires coming from? And completely upset the distinction of the popular in terms of, and especially one of the important distinction at a pan-Indian level, that the only inequalities that matter are class inequalities, because caste does not translate beyond region. So caste is tied to region. How do we reinsert caste into a popular which completely invisibilizes caste? And that I think is a very important gesture through which that struggle will go on.
Yeah. So that also, since I had that in mind, but it didn't come in the line of arguments that I was building on. But since you mentioned it, the other film in this context that comes to my mind in the Indian context is a different film, but a film about caste, which is Court. Yeah. Because in Court, what you get is it's a feature film, of course. It's almost a film made in the spirit of the 1970s realism sort of a movement where all these, the Bengali filmmakers and Govind Nehalani and others are making films with a touch of a kind of documentary, not documentary, but a documentary attitude. Particularly, again, to go back to the initial point in your own films that you showed, this acting, the acting. So, if you remember in Court, the public prosecutor's role, acted by this this fantastic actress in Maharashtra, LSD actress, right? She adopted a style which is a non-style. I have seen nothing more successful as a non-style. That is probably the most powerful performance as non-style. Closest you can get to successfully performing the fiction of documentary in acting. Yeah, and in a way, Court extends that. But even Court, so it extends that to the point of this non-style in the gesture of filmmaking, which is the final scene when the Court lights are being switched off. So all lights are switched off, it's dusk. And you would think this is a kind of end. So literally the end of that form, both in the film and the Court. And the comment is, the social comment, and the story is all absolutely, it's kind of comes to a perfect circle. Everything is done. Yet there is something which happens after that. No?
Yeah.
It's a judge. It's the judges sleeping, and one little surplus there. So something Shomik was saying the other day, which is a kind of surplus jouissance, surplus in the film. So in a way, Chaitanya Tamar actually very consciously creates that surplus, which is not on the side of the director. Actually, the surplus is always there, because the moment the Lok Shahid comes into the scene, he is released from prison, he immediately starts his poetry. And again he is taken to prison. And that's the to and fro you see in the state structure and the Dalit revolt. The poet is captured because he is supposed to be doing something seditious, taken to jail, brought out of jail, immediately starts again doing his seditious stuff. And you seem to look at this is the thing going on, then the court and the whole irony of the court, and it finishes with that ironic comment. But it doesn't. And then that last extra thing happens, and in a way it is the signature of the film, no? Something which is that surplus. And that surplus is a detail, that surplus is something uneconomical, and yet it in a way conveys the whole question of that exit point, the point of exit. It seems to me. And in that sense, it also breaches the old neorealist paradigm, or the old social cinema paradigm. Because the social cinema would never have so they would do such a thing, but you would still do it within the character. The deep play of the detail of the character, the master of that. But this is not like that. It is actually part of the structure, and yet it moves beyond the structure as a kind of counter fetish. It's like a counter fetish. So that was, I think, another kind of paradigm for not Dalit popular at all, but at the same time part of neither an art cinema or a niche cinema. Not an aristocratic cinema in the sense of the old aristocracy of the particular the political cinema or the political aristocracy guided by a certain liberal left class. Not that. So it works on the popular material but builds something strange on it. So this defamiliarization effectively happens there.
And the other day I was talking to Shamik and I said, after Bollywood, can we call this just a neoclassic? That in a sense you take the material of the popular or genre conventions or so on, but you turn it around, you work something with it. And the example we were talking was Once Upon a Time in Anatolia, this Turkish filmmaker Nuri Bilge Ceylan's film, which is about investigation and so on and so forth, which also does very strange things with the very act of investigation in a world where no evidences are reliable, or even if you accumulate all evidences, you will never be able to put the whole picture. And it ends with a postmortem scene where they're trying to figure out whether the man was buried before he was dead or whether he died after he was buried, but there is no conclusive evidence as such possible. But a certain cinematic operations he does is to completely keep the entire postmortem off screen. And the conversation which is happening on the operation table. And several such operations are there throughout the film. The film happens in the course of the night, and the way he films that night is at once, as you said, extremely mundane, rigorous investigation process which is done, but there are certain moments which are elevated from that drudgery. And I think that kind of
So as a concluding point, it seems to me that in the 70s, which is the period of a kind of serious cinema, a kind of movement, it is a serious movement, I've known about it, but it has a particular ethic, which is a kind of ethic of irony, if I put it like that. So at the end, people will not say, I am pro-X party, I am pro-Communist party, I am pro-X, Congress, I am pro-this or that. They will say that it's very Brechtian but ironically modernist, that we have to make our own choice, but it's very difficult to make a choice because reality itself is a kind of impasse. And the filmmaker can only show, as far as possible, all sides, and beyond that, the filmmaker has nothing. The filmmaker really can't take sides. But it was also dissatisfactory because clearly these films were asking you to take sides, not in the cinema, but in life. So with Hrithik Ghatak, there was no confusion. With Hrithik Ghatak, you felt that because of the sheer this surplus reaches a point of sublimity that you felt after Vekita Tara all felt कि अब फिल्म देखना छोड़ देना अब जिंदगी जीनी शुरू करनी है ना अब से आप फिल्म नहीं देखेंगे because that is the moment of conversion, yes, but not a subjective conversion, it's a real conversion. Now that is not happening in the 70s with these filmmakers. The interesting thing with court and a film like that is, and the word that I want to conclude with is the word that you use also for Bollywood, is that court shows not irony, not an image, not an ironic impasse meaning. It shows an operation. This is the interesting. It is a procedure that you see. And if there is something beyond cinema, it is not some permanent bitterness you carry, or this permanent sense of some ascetic challenge that we have to live, we have to be ethical. But what you carry is an operation of thought, which is what you would say is infinite. no operational thought can be finite. The film is finite, but the operational thought is infinite. And the thought passes through, that infinite passes through the finite of the film. So yes, so I think that is a distinction both of us have.
Absolutely. And Kiyosami rephrases in a different way, that you see the seeing itself.
Right.
And I think that is the, as far as we know, cinema has got us, brought us to this point of thinkability. Right. That to see the seeing is to infinitize cinema.
Yeah. So let's open it up, please. Yeah. So I can't see really who, so I think you can just speak and no problem. Yeah.
So my question is to Vaibhav. So you spoke about who defines what is a good image and what is a bad image, and he says that representation, if I got it correct, representation, images which represent something are bad images. Matlab, he has a kind of representation is a sort of making film or doing something, writing and all. Representation comes as a some kind of, you should not do it.
No.
Okay.
No, I just put it very schematically, and it's unfair on my part to sort of blame it on you for that. But I think where we concluded the discussion is precisely that point. Representation per se is not the problem, but to keep the awareness of the representation open. How do you keep that awareness open is up to you. What kind of operations you do for that is up to you. But if you overwhelm the people with representation only, then there is always a problem of the verisimilitude which is going to come back and haunt you. That's what. Representation per se as a strategy, you cannot give up upon, because of course you are telling stories, of course there are characters, of course there is conflict and resolution and so on and so on. But how to keep the awareness of representation open? And I think somewhere there a certain, to use the a rather difficult word in Badio's schematization of three important modalities of aesthetics, a certain didactic intervention. But it's not didactic in a paternalist sense, that one is telling you what to think, but to invite you to think. Not to point a direction in this way or that way, but to encourage you to think. If that is what I would mean by that struggle between the good and the bad. Yeah.
So, just a comment, like a gap in a sense?
Yes, gap.
I think it's better if you give us an example and it will be easier.
Yeah, sure. So, let's take an example which is, I don't know, a more familiar example around us. In a certain sense, I think quote has been discussed so far. Let's take that as an example. So what quote does is that it uses two operations simultaneously. One is where the camera is positioned. So generally it is expected that if a drama is happening, we are supposed to be close to the characters. But he places the camera so far away from it that you do not really have an access to the mid and the close. So it resists that kind of a desire to go up close by positioning the camera in a static way. And the second operation sir was suggesting is that through the pitch of the acting. So the acting is told in a particular manner that an expectation of a quote in cinema, as we know, which is very heated and which is very rhetorical.
Yeah, it's not.
Yeah, not at all. So that suddenly makes the whole thing appear at one level comic, but at another level completely dead.
Yeah.
So it's a blockage of the quote. It's a blockage of that process.
Yeah. So there are two blockages, The two blockages, since this example I mentioned, and since I'm interested in this question of acting. Now, what happens, so Alabadiya has a text called Cinema and Thought, where he speaks about the actor, two kinds of actors in cinema. One is a star actor, which is a popular actor. So he says the popular actor is like a black hole, through which he absorbs all light. No light passes through the actor. That's the star actor. And then there's a cinema actor, who's the, well, if you want good actor and bad actor, but it's not really true. It's not a bad, good thing. Star actors are fantastic actors, but there are different kinds of actors. So the other kind of actor is, we call the subtle actor. The actor through whom as if light passes. The subtle body is a medieval idea of those bodies through which light passes. And then bodies which are opaque, which absorb light. The star actor absorbs light. Now, in a way, what Vaibhav is saying is absolutely correct. The actress playing the prosecutor is somebody who acts in such a it's kind of dead acting, 0-degree acting, that she blocks all affect, insofar as acting produces affect. Rhetorically, skill-wise, personality, everything put together. Acting produces enthusiasm, so you cheer and clap and you weep and thousands of things happen with acting. And this acting blocks. So you're seeing it and you are, in a way, yourself being neutralized. The affect is neutralized, which doesn't mean you're dead. Of course not, you're seeing it. So there's a scene, but this is a pure scene. Because the scene is in a condition of a kind of increasing neutralization. This kind of act. And yet, actually in the film what it is doing, so Vaibhav was right, it's a kind of blockage. It's a kind of blockage. But at the same time, in the film actually what is happening is this blockage is precisely the kind of form through which light passes. So that the film does not become locked in the narrative, the story, but something else happens. Which is what? Which is a docu idea, court. After all, what is a court? Court is a kind of form, it's a kind of ritual. It's a kind of social form mediated through all the social categories which, for instance, include caste. So there is a play written by Peter Weiss called The Investigation, in which it's also court scene, but the court scene is acted in a ritual fashion. So everyone in the court sings or recites. So everything is happening in the court, proper investigation, and yet the form is oratorio. So everything is being recited. In this case, it's the opposite. Everything is being I don't know how to put it. Everything is being said, but as if, forget recitation, as if it's toneless. It's toneless. So it's blocking all the expected affects. But precisely because it is blocking affects at that level, something is opening up. Which is this affect, which is not an affect in the ordinary sense, but something which is an awareness of the operation. So court is a kind of operation. That I think is an example, quite clear example.
Yeah. And to give an example where the different operations are there, I don't know, you've seen this film called Taste of Cherry by Kiarostami. It's about a person who wants to commit suicide. He's a urban, educated, well-off person, but who's completely disillusioned with his life. Whatever, we don't know the backstory of it too much. The film begins where he is in a countryside. He's found a place under a tree, a cherry tree, where he's dug a kind of a grave for himself, but he wants someone to bury him. So he's looking for someone to do that, and throughout the film, he's basically giving lifts to strangers, and after some initial conversation telling them what the real plan is, and obviously everyone is kind of refusing to do so. So towards the end of the film, after the whole day, he comes and he parks his car there and sleeps in the grave. It's all dark. Suddenly it starts lightning and raining, and the entire screen goes black, and we hear rain. Now, one would expect that the film would end there, that he's eternally going to wait in his grave for someone to bury him. But no, what Kiarostami does is he's reopened the scene. Like after the darkness and the rain comes the green. So the entire scenery, all the hills and so on, are in a long shot you see are all green, and a shooting crew has come there to basically record certain sounds, location sounds which they want to use, and it is precisely that film which we are watching so far. We see it that it's a shooting of that film. So and it's a classic Brechtian gesture in a certain way, but not Brechtian in a didactic ideological sense. It completely gives you an awareness that, and another popular example of our times, and actually both are great examples which I would like to connect to Taste of Cherry. So here, what Taste of Cherry is doing is that it basically affirms life. It is not telling you that to make a suicide is bad, or sort of to be depressed is kind of, you need a psychiatrist and you need a cure. It's not trying to do any of those reformist gestures. It straight away goes to the fundamental problem of affirming life. That life is something in a certain, and he's already said it in his earlier film, Life Goes On. So it gives you a completely different, it makes you put things in perspective. That your own feet, that you are overwhelmed by your own life, but if you look at life in its widest possible sense, then of course, I mean, yeah. So what? So what you're overwhelmed? So what this is happening? In Hindi cinema, I think the two great gestures, I would say one is Aakho Dekhi and the other is Andhadhun. I don't have, you've seen a film called Aakho Dekhi? So you've heard of it. So basically it's about a person who decides at one point that he will not believe on anything he has not seen. And it goes to its logical extreme that he, after his daughter's wedding, he's gone to Mathiran for a second honeymoon with his wife, and he's never traveled with her till then, after they got married. And he's looking at the birds and very happy, and he says, oh, as if I'm flying. That. She says, but you never, you're not a bird, you have not experienced it. How can you say that, oh, they are having such a great time flying there and so on and so forth? Then he's in a flux. Okay, how do I experience flying? We come to the next morning scene where he's standing by the cliff and he jumps. He jumps, the normal expectation is that he's going to fall and he'll be suicidal and he dies. And he starts floating, and on the soundtrack we hear he says, "Ki main ud raha hu." So that is a cinematic operation, that I will not let this go into that tragic fall or a suicide. I will elevate it. So yeah.
So you
No, it's very it's fascinating to see how, following your more or less same orientation of thinking, both of you have set up a disjunction among yourselves, a kind of a role of a skeptic and a role of someone who affirms that particular philosophy. But I was just thinking that this problem that Sir Soman, you are pointing out, that on one hand you have something like the real of cinema in terms of this gesture, that melancholic gesture that you are saying, the vanishing point of the image, the kind of ephemerality of the image itself. And on the other hand, what Romu is saying, that there is a kind of that this real of this rupture, this real of this ephemerality, this eventual gesture is something which in today's reality, with this kind of a rapid reproduction of the images, you find that it is because of that it is rather than a revolutionary moment. Can we see it in counter revolution's relationship to revolution, in the sense that it is precisely that today it is a counter revolutionary time, in the sense of this kind of a hyper generation of images, that it is perhaps in cinema that you find this gesture possible. Which brings me to what I am wanting to ask, which is that it seems to me that beneath this relationship between cinema and revolution, what we are all discussing about, there is a evident relationship between history and philosophy. In what sense? In the sense that which we were all discussing about, that, for example, Rancière, for example, points out this problem in Deleuze, that this Deleuze's periodization vis-a-vis his own philosophy makes it unsustainable, or makes it discontinuous to what he himself is saying, that he is giving something like an ontology of the image, but at the same time, on the basis of that kind of an ontology, which is supposed to work for the entirety of cinema,
It only gives a historical.
Dividing cinema into the classical and the modern. So, and that to this division, which can be an ontological division, is nevertheless coincides with something like history, something like the war period, where the post-war cinema becomes the modern cinema. So how does then cinema and politics, cinema and history relate to each other under this kind of a framework? Now, in case of Badi, what seems to me, and it is very fascinating to hear both of you and to think about, is that this problem of saturation that we were talking about, that this problem of a new is it that it is a new paradigm of cinema which has started now, or is it that is it an end of cinema in that sense, or is it that the saturation of one configuration of cinema which brings forth a new configuration of cinema? So there I was thinking that this now if you see Bhagavad, you have this a kind of a general proposition which has certain which has a kind of distribution and specific implication. So the general proposition is that something like that cinema proposes new synthesis in the sense that it brings together what you were also talking about, that it brings about it brings two elements which are completely different, which are completely, in other words, do not share anything organic to get together in a kind of a disjunctive synthesis. So this being a kind of a cinema as the emergence of new synthesis. The cinema constantly produces new synthesis is what makes cinema an artistic. This is the operation of what Somo is pointing out, an operation of thinking which cinema produces. Now, that this general thesis that cinema produces new synthesis is divided in, it can be found in many aspects of cinema. So one of the aspects that he talks about is the aspect of this non-artistic material and the artistic form of cinema. That cinema is a constant purification of the non-artistic, it works on the non-artistic material, which you were saying as a bad image and a good image. So, so it is one of the many new syntheses that cinema can bring. But what I am a bit here, I would like to play the role of a skeptic, and so what I am a bit skeptical about is that this point that you are making, that this Kirostam is this 24 frames that you were saying, that this kind of a no. Of course, what you are saying is absolutely, absolutely central to this problem. But this kind of, should we not see all of the operations of cinema, exactly what we are talking about, as this constant synthesis which is not on the side of a unity, not on the side of the fact that the montage cut and the long shot, the long sequences are put in a synthesis, in a unified synthesis together. But that is the other way around. That it is something specific to cinema, that it can bring these two together all the time, maintaining its disunity, maintaining its maintaining its rupture. That, and not just at the level of this very precise this problem of temporality of montage and long duration, but at many levels. At the level of this thing also, at the level of this production of images, contemporary production of images, and its making into the art of cinema. So that within that there is something like that cinema gives us in that sense a hope, that along with melancholy, that it gives us a hope that to bring in again hope, that in a time, in a counter-revolutionary time, in a time when there is this kind of a blast of images, that cinema precisely maintains the possibility of a revolution as a fiction.
Yes. I
I completely agree, and I think we can look at the cinematic screen as a canvas upon which these fictions are to be painted. And so when the analog form was withering away in 80s and video came up, Godard was one of the first ones to celebrate it. He was not nostalgic that now we do not have the film stock.
He said, now I will paint with video. So there is this painterly gesture is very important in cinema. Otherwise, because one will get overwhelmed by cinema as a mirror to the reality or a window to a reality which is outside. So yes, the fictions which are to be painted on the screen is a very important point, you see, yeah, to keep the hope alive. At the same time, I don't know, I mean, I'm just sort of thinking it while I'm speaking this point, is that somewhere in the entire discussion on revolution, there has been this tension between the law and desire. So, can we say that cinema is constantly trying to in a way, respond to this tension between law and desire by keeping the desire for the unknown alive, which is the same of the fiction's problem, but here I want to look at it more subjectively rather than just cinematic form as such. That maybe I think, and here hope is not hope for a destination or hope for a particular thing which is going to happen, but hope in a sense, as Sir was talking about Tarkovsky, that in Tarkovsky you constantly have these gestures of hope, and a hope of someone who is a non-believer or an agnostic. So it's a new metaphysics that cinema is trying to bring. That what does it mean to live in a world without God, without origin, without end? So where we are always in the middle, and where there is no salvation, and so on and so forth. So cinema is in a way trying to make this a mass awareness, this metaphysical formulation.
Through Rene, the cinema is a kind of brain. Is a kind of brain. You know, it's a kind of art. It's a cinematic brain. So Alain René's films are really images as if they are externalizations of a brain, but it's not a physical brain.
Projection.
It's a projection. Yeah. So it's a brain which is a metaphysics, but the metaphysics is outside.
Yes.
It's not inside.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a kind of cognitive metaphysics.
Huh.
Yeah. So I want to say something on that. Yes, there is a question of awareness. There is a question of how revolution can be thought, but how there is also a certain limitations as far as question of awareness is concerned, and that is in the sense that how the movies that, for example, we talk about code, how they will be they will be put on Netflix in conjunction with other movies. They will pop up at a certain time. There is a kind of a meta framing of the framing that goes on. There was a one time it was spoken that every photograph is framed by certain kind of text. Today, cinema is also framed by further images, and Netflix actually does keeps an eye level, eyeball level record of everyone who is watching, right? And based upon this, not only gives you new suggestions, it is producing new shows. And many people like who I talk to, they are like, we keep on watching without knowing what we are watching. We don't know why we can do it. This practice for a long time has been produced, has been done, it has been this technique of keeping what people are watching and producing things based upon that. It has been there in pornography. And pornography works, it works on the principle that there is a connection between arousal and lack of awareness in that sense. So, where I am, images are framed in a way in further images, and there is a sort of so much prevalence of images that if one has to think of end of cinema, it is also possible to think of word itself as a long take. And the value of long take comes when you can end it and you can see it from outside. But what happens that when we are part of that long take and which is kind of ongoing. So for me,
then it becomes interesting to think this question of awareness, question of subject, and question of regulation at that moment. That how would how we might certain people what intended in the movies like Code, and how it is framed in the in the industry might be two different things.
Yeah.
No, I was just extending that, I just a specific thing, that do you think that this thing that Said is talking about, this current emergence of this rapid reproduction of images, do you think that there is something like a saturation, not an end, but a saturation of the earlier period, which is the, say, the modern period of cinema, so that we are today, we have to have what you are calling a neoclassical understanding of cinema today. That can only happen if we think that the earlier phase is saturated. That the film of Choudhury stands as an exceptional testimony to that earlier phase of cinema. That today we have to think of cinema in specifically this way of a purification of impure materials, rather than in terms of in terms of an artistic authorship that you had prior to it.
At the same time, most normal example are exceptional.
So, this is absolutely, it's making a lot of sense, these schematizations. At the same time, I think we should be very careful, since I myself tried to coin this end of cinema kind of a phrase. But we should again make it a very empirical, positivistic sort of a proposition. Because on the one hand, cinema, Ritika has said this, cinema is not a form, it has many forms. It's a living mixture, it's a mixture of forms. To that extent, there is always impurity. And even this term purification, I think Badiou also at the same time uses the term, and which I like much more than purification, impurification. So all purification is also an impurification. There is no purification. So there is no actual elixir. There is no absolute like that alchemical core that you are going to get out of it. It's an impurification. It's an operation. So all operations are impurifications. But yes, that operation has to take place. But it always takes place upon the material. And that is true of at every point in history, insofar as history is a history of materialities. So what we're talking about is a particular threshold in a history of cinema, which is also a history of the condition of cinema, which is capitalism and many other things, technology of course, which is a threshold of saturation. Now again, saturation cannot be an absolutely positivistic sort of a verification that there is an absolute saturation. Saturation, while there is saturation, there is still further saturation. In that sense, it is carrying on. So it's an intensification. But that intensification is also counter-revolutionary intensification. Now, what does it mean to say counter-revolution? Counter-revolution is a paradoxical idea, no? It's something which I've written about and lots of people have worked on this. Counter-revolution refers to a revolution, but at the same time says that it is greater than the revolution, or it is, well, counter-revolution is an idea of purity. The counter-revolution is purer. Counter-revolution is an original pure moment, but revolution is only too historical, it's only contingent, it's only historical in the sense of something which happens only in a particular period in a particular society. While counter-revolution is a thesis about this is how human beings are. This is what society is. This is what art is. But it is counter-revolution. Hence, it always refers to something prior to it, which is revolution. So, in counter-revolution, there is always this knot, this problem. Now, if you apply this to cinema, you get the same result. That on the one hand, you cannot have counter-revolution unless the revolution is still there. Counter-revolution is parasitic on revolution. So, in that sense, it cannot be a total, that there is no revolution. The point is, it's a paradigm, the measure. Counter-revolution is the contemporary measure. So, to that extent, there is no revolutionary hope in the immediate sense that, yes, something like a revolution sequence is unfolding on a global scale. But It is not true for on a local case. So I would strongly suggest and state, and I've written about this, that in the Indian configuration, a Dalit revolution is very real. Now you cannot show that this is the revolution right there. You can't touch the revolution in that positivistic sense. But that's precisely the problem with the idea of revolution. Hence, revolution is an idea. And that is what Ale Badiou is trying to say. That the materiality, the idea remains as powerful as ever. In that sense, it is still there. It is very much there. Only thing is, it cannot be realized in the empirical sense of something which can be then hegemonic, which can enter into state systems, which can enter into culture industry. You know, to that extent, yes, counter-revolution is a paradigm. But there can be no counter-revolution without revolution. So we cannot say there is no revolution and there is only, that will make no sense. So yeah, I just wanted to clarify.
Absolutely. Yes. And in fact, I will just extend what you're saying, that that cinema is basically the site of affirmation that there is no image of revolution. That revolution is not an image. There cannot be a representation of it. So, like in a political-philosophical sense, you say revolution is a revolutionary hypothesis. So, in that sense, cinema is a wager that there cannot be. And I think the film which we saw just now, Intense Now, is primarily engaging with this problem, that it is working with a material which was shot 50 years ago by different people in different locations, and putting that together, it is trying to create a vanishing moment which is intense and vanishing at once, yet affirming that vanishing. So maybe I think, maybe when we say melancholic, we are I think misusing the term there. Maybe it's affirming the vanishing. So
at the same time, this melancholy is you're right, it's a subjective, yes, it's a dominant subjective disposition. Yeah. It's a kind of environment. So melancholy is a kind of environment. Yeah. So it basically shows lack of courage, lack of strength. Yeah. So I'm not saying power, because power is a political word in the sense of state politics. Yeah. But there is something like courage and strength, collective strength. Melancholy shows that our strength is weak. Yeah. So for instance, today there is talk of war, there is actual action, and many of us, we are worried, we have real anxiety. But suppose you ask collectively, do you feel you are up to this moment? Most of us will say no. And this is not just true of India. Here probably we are doing better. But an Ale Badiou sitting in France feels weak. This is what we must understand. The great philosopher that he is a weak man. And he says so. He's talking against melancholy and says, I feel melancholic. Yeah. This is the thing that we must, understand. That it's not a question of standing outside. But at the same time, it's not a question of accepting the inside where we are. Yeah. It is just tearing apart of ourselves. Yeah. That some gestures of cinema presented still in such a way that nothing else, and it simply becomes immortal.
Yeah. So basically, how to prevent that melancholy from becoming corrosive?
Yeah.
From letting
even those things are not part of our choice. Yeah. It's very existential. Yeah. It might even become corrosive. How can you help it? How can you help it? But to keep these, as far as possible, all these possibilities going in our, as we are thinking about these things. That is the only thing. And in a way, thinking is not internal. Again, Deleuze, I would say, Deleuze has to be saved from all his own, people who love Deleuze, sometimes he must be saved from that. He's someone who is always saying that we have to, because he loves, say, Beckett, someone who writes about weakness. But in weakness, something which must go on, something which is not to settle down in weakness, So, we haven't spoken of Beckett, but Beckett is that filmmaker who basically wrote a film script, no? Yeah. And filmmaker who cannot be classified in revolution or counter-revolution. He's that point of, again, that neutral point, that 0 point. But that 0 point, which is absolutely unique, In a way, he's also the point, coming to Said's observation, which is very important, is also the point which will resist both the Netflix kind of appropriation, which is a continuous monitoring of your unconscious. Yeah, he'll resist it. But he'll also resist the hyper-consciousness of a sort of a very, a kind of post-revolution Soviet cinema project.
Yeah.
A state project where cinema becomes, again to remember some years back in JNU, some of us who were working with left organizations and independent left and all that, the cinema is enthusiasm. So people who had close links at one time to Naxalite politics but had come out of it would say not guns but cameras. Yeah? So gaon mein camera lekar pahunch chahiye. But in a very serious way. That kind of cinema is enthusiasm. Cinema is militancy. Of course, that collective strength is not there. I don't think people can say collectively गांव में कैमरा लेकर पहुंचे, क्योंकि गांव में कैमरा लेकर पहुंच चुके हैं आज तक वाले पहुंच चुके हैं, तो that's not हम हार चुके हैं. So at the same time हार चुके हैं does not mean settle down in that. Cinema's existence there.
Or, in fact, since we're talking about Netflix, I think if you see the way someone like Alfonso Cuarón negotiates with Netflix, makes Roma, which is intensely political and which is too political for Netflix to handle, but they celebrate it as Netflix original. So, and that I think is still possible by remaining indifferent to the kind of seducing expectations there from Netflix content, but yet to use that content. So, in a sense, not to completely let yourself carried in either of the directions, stand in the side nor outside, and to go on. Yeah.
So I'll take two of the examples that you took of, say, Taste of Cherry and Alcohol. So, it's not a comment, it's a question, but not a direct question, but like my view on it, so I would like to know your view on that. So, say for example, why for me Taste of Cherry would be a good film and Aankho Dekhi not a good film. And if I were not to posit my, say, subjective views, but take it from how you also picked out certain sections of the film. So, say when you talk about, say, Taste of Cherry, what I could find, what I could at least feel was that you are still, it's very difficult for a spectator to place Taste of Cherry as a, say, affirmation of narrative in films, because it remains a formal, like Kiarostami is a formalist, but he brings a narrative to it. Or whether you look at it as like, see, narrative is there still, it's about formalism. It is not about that, because and that's where I think somewhere a very interesting part of Kiarostami's politics lies, in the sense he, through his cinema, he touches upon something, the gap, basically the gap, whether it is cinema, whether it is forms or whether it is narrative, which I think later Godard maybe becomes revisionist, because he forms into somewhere into a complete form. And which is related to the question of whether cinema, whether there is a death of cinema, in the sense whether cinema is about a certain form, or whether cinema is about a narrative, or whether cinema, because of its means of not being easily definable, can touch upon the gap all the time. Like, has the possibility to touch upon the gap all the time. And where I think Netflix is also, despite its very calculated marketing to look at the niche market, given that now cinema is not a thinking form, as in, it's not a collective thinking form, like festivals or many things don't happen as much. Like, it's more of a private form, and thinking has become a private form, which is like the for me is an extremely apolitical form of thinking, is because Netflix will try to reach to that supposed thinking / needs, but that is itself is not cinema, because cinema can go beyond what even Netflix is trying to categorize cinema as. So, what would be your response?
I think first about forms, cinema, is it a form or are there forms? I think what Sir was earlier talked about, I think Ghatak's famous formulation that cinema is not a form. There are forms of cinema. So, insofar as that, I don't think there is a question of one form as the pure form and that form is ending. So, that is not a question. Yeah, it can always touch the real, or it can always touch the gap. And I think this touching is a cinematic operation. that touching without totalizing, touching without representing, touching without exhausting. So I think that can still be done, irrespective of the classical form of cinema remains there or not. About, yes, that there is no collective, I personally in my lifetime not experienced that kind of a collective enthusiasm. I only heard stories of that. And that too from people coming from either Kerala or from Bengal and others, because Maharashtra never really had a film viewing culture at such at a public level. There were very few film societies, but fortunately I coming from Pune, there was Film Institute and National Film Archives. But there also I never really seen a collective enthusiasm of viewing films. So my film viewing began with piracy, with DVDs, with downloads and all of that. So I don't think really, I don't consider it as apolitical to watch even a film on a phone while traveling. Wherever you watch it, literature is something, we don't consider literature as something, if I read on my own, suddenly becomes apolitical. The same, and Badlu makes it very powerful at this point. He says that cinema, even when there are 1,000 spectators, cinema still isolates people. It's not like theatre that they are brought together. So in the darkness of film viewing experience, you are already inseparate, if you want to use the Sartre of framing. So I think that inseparateness is always there, but then like people who watch that film separately come together, talk about it, or even if they have not seen those films, they still talk about it. So insofar as that, I think the viewing patterns do not necessarily affect the political intensity of film per se. Because there again, one will sort of zero in upon some kind of a puritanical paradigm. That only a certain kind of a collective enthusiasm of cinema makes it political.
But let me just try to just explain very briefly what this collective enthusiasm might involve. It involves a certain faith in universality.
Yes.
So this collective enthusiasm is not an enthusiasm of a certain number of people from a certain niche, whether it be a film or because there have been movements in Bengal and Kerala, particularly of film clubs, and in Delhi also the Celluloid Club in Delhi University when we were students. It was a huge movement. JNU somehow never had that kind of movement, but film clubs and transmission. But the premise of all that was, and this is something which is common to the scene of the film, the making of the film. And in that sense, when I speak of end of cinema, I do not mean, again, positivistically that there is no cinema. And nor is it a technical idea of form. It is a paradigm of the concept of cinema as created by the attribute of a certain universality. The universality of the author and the universality of a possible viewership. Now, what does that mean? It means that the author is somebody who is, again, an operation, which means the operation of art. The author is an artist. The filmmaker is an artist. What does it mean? It doesn't mean that he or she is someone who has been, for instance, chosen by a certain kind of a producer to say, you are the right filmmaker to make this particular theme. That is an operation which is already empirical, which is already geared to something which is external to the film, which is a certain audience who is already correlated to a statistic, that this is the audience for profile for a particular theme. Even the idea of theme is external to the film, because it already is something which comes from a genre or a narrative form or a story idea. Now all of these are there in the making of film. Yet the concept of cinema, and Godar is someone who testified to it, the concept of cinema was that cinema is something which is autonomous insofar as it collects all this and then makes something else. And the one who does it is someone who is not a sovereign, who is not someone who is sitting above it. He himself or she himself is part of the procedure, and yet her signature is irreducible. So that's the author. So the author is a function of cinema, and yet the author is the cause of cinema.
Yes.
This is the reciprocal presupposition.
Yeah.
This paradigm, if not ends, weakens. So it doesn't matter today who the filmmaker is. Yeah. So of course, in commercial cinema, and all cinema, whether it's money, whether it's producer, informally the producer is going to come and tell the filmmaker, yeah, ye elements are done. But it's not part of the assemblage of cinema. It's something which is happening sort of in the background. Today it is part of the assemblage. Not just a contract, but the assemblage. It's a part of the social enunciation of cinema that the producer is part of this agreement on what a film is. So film is a kind of assemblage of many. So of course you have filmmakers, very great filmmakers. Nevertheless, the paradigm of this kind of singularity of the artist definitely is today made into something else. So now again, this is a paradigm, doesn't mean everyone falls into it. So again, there are exceptions to this paradigm, or there are possible resistances to this paradigm. So this is what I mean when I speak of the end of cinema. I do not mean cinema empirically has ended up. That would be very strange to say. It would be stupid to say that. I don't mean that at all. I mean this idea of cinema as something signed. The auteur idea. But auteur not just of anything, but of a certain value, which is art. Now, that I think is put to a different kind of a measure, which is the measure of fetish, which is the measure of something which is not cinema but image as such. So even the image is external to cinema. Forget story, even the image is external to cinema. But today what has happened? Image can, although it is I am showing you talking about it, it's an axiom that cinema must have a story. Who is a good filmmaker? Someone who is a good storyteller. But this axiom in the Czech movement, in the French movement, in the German movement would be something really. This axiom has to be dismantled. It has to be put to severe deconstructions. But there is a restoration here. So to that extent, yes, I would say it corroborates the kind of counter-revolutionary. Again, that does not mean that while this is happening, there is no cinematic operation as such. Again, the operations are there, but against the current. That is what I have.
Yeah.
No, but that to extend this, but isn't it exactly in this scenario? In this scenario where there is no this paradigm of the auteur is something which is not viable anymore. That one can actually propose something which someone like Vaibhav or anybody would be proposing. That cinema has never been an art, but cinema has always been capable of art. This is the point. That isn't it exactly today that because it is in this phase, because it is in this kind of this new what you are calling a neoclassical phase of that, it is because of that today we can propose something for the entirety of cinema as an artistic medium. That cinema has never been an art, like you have, because cinema has never had to deal with the problem of its own history. Because cinema is a 20th century, kind of a 20th century emergence. That cinema has always had this pure possibility of being an art. That cinema is always capable of it.
But just to finish my point, you're right. But then, what Vaibhav is talking about is art. He's talking about art in general. Which is an art, which is not an art, by certain standards of philosophical and ontological thinking. That is alright. Cinema is not an art, theatre is a different kind of an art, and dance is a kind of body which is on the way to. All of these are absolutely okay. By the measure of a certain ontological criterion, parameters. What I'm saying is something which is from within cinema. It might or might not be an art, that's a different discussion. But its claim to art, whether it's an art or not, is a philosopher's decision. And Vaibhav is completely free to do that, and we can discuss Vaibhav or even agree with him. That is not the only discussion. When in a particular kind of historical stage and moment, an ex-filmmaker, and that can extend to Satyajit Ray to Subhash Ray, strangely, who in a sense would still claim that this is a film which I have made. Yeah, in the sense of the strong idea of the author. Now, of course, Subhash Ray he will blush a little bit if said कि ये art है. Yeah. लेकिन point is कि the condition for thinking about art from a certain kind of discourse on art is that it is finally marked by the signature of the so-called author, the author. Now, that doesn't make it art in the sense of an ontological thesis. Might or might not, that's a different discussion. But its claim to art discussively remains at that point. That more or less, I don't know whether it's there or not there now, but it will be at least arranged differently. There will be a different contestation on that particular. So, art, surely, subjectively, filmmakers would still want to claim art for themselves. They would say, no, we are artists. But some other guy will come from somewhere else who will be a kind of producer, a distributor, a manager and say, well, you might say it's an art, but ultimately it's a product. And the word product will have as much effective truth as the word art. Now, in the 60s, probably even in the 80s, I do not know, this periodization is all very wobbly, but even a popular filmmaker, Subhash Dev was just a caricature, but you can take a serious commercial filmmaker, a good commercial filmmaker, Vijayanand, someone who will say art and people will take that claim seriously. Because discursively, the word art will have an effective truth. Today, it might have an effective truth, but there will be other words which will have a competing effective truth. Yeah? That is the change of paradigm. Otherwise, philosophically speaking, from a Badiou point of view, he has a perfect right to work it all out in terms of what you are saying. Very correct. Never art, but capable of that horizon. Absolutely.
No, I would like to add small. I agree that the environment has changed where the significance of auteur or a certain kind of legitimacy to claim authorship is dwindling because of appropriation by market on the other hand, and there is no collective enthusiasm for that kind of an authorship in terms of film movements and clubs and so on. But on the other hand, I find a development which may not appear very significant in terms of its presence in our mediated world is, and I think that's the minoritarian or micro movement which Kiarostami introduces, I feel, is that somewhere I think the authorship is now firmly encouraging and inviting a certain co-creation as a form of authorship. So authorship is dispersing itself. So and one of the interesting names for that is to each his own cinema, and that is not a relativist gesture. There is something called as cinema. We are talking about Akko or Taste of Cherry. So there is something like that, but it is opening up that possibility, and while doing that, it is trying to learn. And many authors have spoken about it explicitly of last 20 years, that they are trying to recommence the modernist project by learning from the failures of classical modernist project. Both the interwar as well as the post-war and 60s and 70s and 80s, is that one form of that is a neoclassical gesture where you use the narrative structures very intelligently and you intercept them and subvert them and so on and so forth. And in America you have Coens and Tarantino who do Arjun Jarmusch. But those who are not making that neoclassical gestures are also traversing very different paths. Say a Thai filmmaker, one of my favorite, called Apichatpong Veerasethu. He's actually bringing very different material together, where he brings in myth and fuses that with narrative structures. He brings certain Buddhist meditation practice and iconography which comes along with it. Then he's also a video art and a practitioner in installation, so he brings elements from that. So I think new constellations are being configured, which are so I would say that maybe somewhere they all have realized that let's give up upon the heroism of being an auteur, but let's turn auteur into a project which is a program which is ongoing, an exploratory program.
That's a fascinating point. Now, the thing to really discuss from there is that this project, is it something which is an intra-artistic development? With the word art, of course, being still sorted out, we don't know what art is or if cinema is an art. All that is very. Nevertheless, is it an intra-artistic development or an intra-artistic itinerary? Or is it something, while being intra-artistic, is also a project which is introduced or inserted or insinuated by a parallel constellation or a further constellation, which is the constellation of the conditions of cinema, which is the market. Yeah. So both these things I think are going on the same. Again, they shouldn't be seen in one direction.
Yeah.
They should be seen precisely in a sense of both the possibility comes from a restrictive condition, which is money, capital, market, the school system. At the same time, there is something in the very operation that is instinct. Yes. Or trying to make something of it. How far it works or doesn't work is another question. At what stage things are is something you people know more about than I do. But I think by and large these are the things that we need to keep in mind instead of looking for very punctual or perfect images or perfect propositions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. I think in fact one can see the dialectic playing very clearly there that on the subjective end of the spectrum, as we've been talking about, that this departure from classical revolutionary paradigm and to rethink everything from everything afresh.
Yeah.
So to go back to the basics.
This discussion that Shomik and I are having and everything, these people who do not go into the Netflix path, who resist it, now Quentin Tarantino. Now, what do they represent? Do they represent an old world heroism? Do they represent stubbornness, merely personal ego? Do they represent a thinking which is marginal, but still they are huge filmmakers, so also they exert a certain power? What is going on there? Yeah, that's something, So it is in the present, it's not about 60s, it is right now.
Right. I don't know how to sort of look at it because the figure, the heroic gestures in our times can also immediately be this kind of a narcissistic and self-fulfilling gestures also. So how to, in a sense, find that spot where you are not a hero and yet you are deciding, you are making decisions. So maybe I think there are different forms of decisions there, where one cannot really make one decision as superior to the others. So you may choose the milieu in which you are working, but yet if you continue to sort of hold on to this prerogative of making decisions, is it? I don't know. I'm just sort of proposing this as a and especially because I mean, as we know that the end of capitalism is nowhere near in sight, but we know that it is through the internal contradictions it would unravel. But obviously, it is something which, and it's not a question of prediction at all. So, in that situation, I think it is. I mean, can we say that there is a possibility of supporting from both within and also at the margins?
But these are things you people know, and you should discuss it.
I think this anonymous heroism, this thing of these directors who have become very famous now, Hollywood directors, but in their beginning, the way they were starting, this kind of a negotiation with what Shom was saying, the negotiation with the captain, say Tarantino for Reservoir Dogs, or say even Nolan for following all of these, even if you see these as not an auteur problem, but problem exactly of this anonymity of the heroic gesture, which is a distributable gesture in the all of cinema today. Later on, when they become big names and you have that is not some of their best work is their early work.
So I can think of another case which is interesting. I mean, we were discussing this film called. It's made by a filmmaker who's probably about 26-year-old.
No, he was 21.
21, there you go. He's probably 24, 25 now.
Yeah.
Now, this is like either you think of it in the old idea of a prodigy, like some.
Or like Xavier Dolan, who was even younger than that.
But that's the idea of the model of a prodigy. Yes. So you have Mozart at 16 composing a great opera or something like that. But actually, if you see, well, the filmmaker could be an excellent filmmaker, very talented at a very young age. But it's also a new condition of exposure to technology. Exposure, a certain kind of apprenticeship, which is very different from early 20th century apprenticeship. And finally, the idea of production, which is like you're very correctly saying, collaborative, co-creative. So you don't put that kind of a heroic weight on the author anymore. So that filmmaker could be a fantastic filmmaker, but you also are insured partly against the risk of taking a first time and 21-year-old because you have more or less a product in mind. More or less. And of course the money is calculated in different ways now. Earlier, it would either be a prodigy who would just do for something out of the blue, or you would wait for the hero has to prove his heroism. So kind of the idea of the author is also then to be seen at the idea of the oeuvre. So it is never a single film, it's not a singularity, it's an oeuvre. It's the life's work. So it is actually the author is always an old man. Yeah? And today we have a different kind of an idea, which is the single filmmaker or a single film sort of creator.
Right.
Yeah?
Right.
Which is a very different
paradigm,
to think about in this context. The thing you're saying about hero and all that.
Yeah.
So in very real terms, it is something to be understood in a different way.
Absolutely. And there are certain filmmakers who, in fact, do all by themselves. They do the sound design, color correction.
That's the technology.
Yeah, which is now possible. Infrastructurally as well as economically, both ends it's possible. So on the one hand, you go into the collaborative direction, and there are in fact film collaboratives also coming up where they're doing it together, but not in the same kind. You have the Zigaberto Collective, which was in a more ideologically charged environment. Now I think it is more in an environment where cinema would be seen as a certain form of thinking. And there I would like to come to an interesting suggestion Vaibhav makes that maybe cinema needs to be inserted into pedagogy right from a very early stage. So somewhere I think the engagement with cinema there is what we were earlier talking about at a cognitive metaphysical level, which is also happening and which is a very micro moment and which may not find its appearances within the hyper-mediatized discourse on cinema, which is about the eyeballs and which is about Netflix and revenues and all of that. So I think maybe it is changing the character of cinema, and I agree that it is changing. We call it what end of cinema, post cinema is. It's a different thing, but I think there is a moment of dispersion which is happening, and we need not necessarily just affirm it as a positive thing only. Of course, because there is the capitalist apparatus through which it is happening, there is a technology and so on. But I think one important thing which can't be missed is a new subjective disposition it is tapping into, that thinking is nobody's monopoly.
Yeah,
and I think that is what cinema could exert this idea very powerfully.
But it's also reaffirming that, again, that was always does. His fundamental thesis on the ontology of cinema, which is the first art whose subject is the mass. Because there have been mass art, even theatre is a kind of mass art. Yeah? Thousands of people come to the theatre. They used to in Greek times. But which is the theatre? Which is not auto? So there is already question this auto-worship idea, in the sense of empirical individual being something like the mass. Yeah. So to that extent, it gets reaffirmed in a completely different modality, probably, but it still gets reaffirmed. So I think we can wind up now and have some tea, maybe.
Yeah.
So
thank you, sir, and thank you, Vaibhav. So tomorrow we have a day-long workshop on the theme contra aesthetics, relationship between philosophy, politics, and art. So we'll start around say 10 o'clock, 10:15, and so yeah, please do come.
Yeah. I think a round of applause for Vaibhav.
Thank you to Shaumin for sort of setting this up, and it's almost a dreamlike situation that you can converse with Sir here. Because I remember my first encounter with Sir, the first time I met him was in this auditorium, and it was also around the question of cinema. So Bergman and Antonioni both passed away, and there was a festival organized by Arts and Aesthetics, and Sir was introducing, if I'm not mistaken, either Magic Flute or Cries and Whispers, one of those films, and then I remember he walked out and then I spoke to him there. So I think, and then I showed my film made in 2008, and then Sir was speaking from here. So So now looking back,
I also have some. Yeah.
so yeah, and so now I think re-looking back at these two moments, I'm really thankful to Shaunik to make this happen. So,
Let's all go.
Yeah.